He was one of the richest men. He owned a studio. Girls were flocking to him.
He was eccentric, there's no question about it. He wasn't crazy.
He may have been strange in that he had so damn much money.
He probably made the greatest aviation picture ever made, Hell's Angels.
Planes and the aviation industry were his first love.
Oh, he loved machines more than he did people, really.
Hughes was a man who lived on his ability to get along because they would make exceptions for him.
He was wealthy and he was powerful, and he had cash.
He'd say, well, just remember, there's no one that I can't buy or destroy.
He was, for all intents and purposes, an inmate because he was a prisoner of his own fears.
He wanted me to be in constant touch with him. And I'd always, I just spoke to the poorest man in the world.
Howard Hughes' life began in Houston, Texas, Christmas Eve 1905. The Texas oil industry was booming, and Hughes' father left his law practice to live the life of a wildcatter. Although not an immediate success in the oil business, he made ends meet by taking on odd jobs. His luck changed, however, when he bought a wooden prototype for the Rock Eater, an oil drilling bit which could chew through thick slabs of rock, the source of frustration for many an oilman. Upon manufacturing and testing the bit, Hughes Sr. brought a partner on board and founded the Sharp Hughes Tool Company. While his father was away selling his new discovery, Hughes' overprotective mother stayed home and lavished unusual amounts of attention on her only child.
His mother was a very powerful influence on him. Partly, I think, as much as anybody, helped instill this sort of lifelong phobia or fear anyway of germs.
At the age of 16, Howard was away at school when he learned that his mother had died during surgery. 2 years later, Howard's father died of a heart attack.
When that happened, Hughes began to exhibit all the traits that you would see throughout his life. That very strong-willed character, that tremendous streak of independence. Nobody's going to tell me what to do with my money or how to run my various enterprises. All of those things that really dominated him as an adult manifested themselves very quickly, much to the surprise and anger, by the way, of the other family members.
He was smart enough at age 19 to go before a judge in Houston, convince the judge that he was sophisticated enough to buy his uncle, who owned, who also had ownership in Hughes Tool, at which time he became the sole owner of Hughes Tool.
But he wanted control from day one, from the time he was 19, 20 years old, which was the one word, if you were going to describe the man from day one to the end, was control. He wanted to control everything.
Firmly in control of Hughes Tool Company, young Howard married socialite Ella Rice, packed their bags, and headed for Hollywood, a place whose glamour had always fascinated him. His uncle, screenwriter Rupert Hughes, was there to introduce him to the moguls of the film industry. The newlyweds settled into a Spanish-style home on fashionable Muirfield Road. Hollywood society embraced him, but secretly referred to him as the sucker with the money. Hughes began to immerse himself in the business of movie making, spending months on film sets, absorbing all the technical knowledge he could. He'd spend entire evenings dismantling film projectors, obsessed with learning every nuance of the industry. In a pattern that would continue the rest of his life, Hughes stopped carrying a watch, no longer distinguishing between day and night. During what he called his awake hours, he'd work up to 40 hours without sleep, breaking only for an occasional can of beans or an avocado and bacon sandwich. Once familiar with the cluttered sets, swinging moods of actors and directors, and the general confusion of filmmaking, Hughes decided it was time to become a player. He chose as his first project a story called Swell Hogan, an ill-fated venture that cost him $60,000. Hughes' family and associates begged him to stop squandering his fortune and get out of the picture business. He ignored them and immediately put up money for Everybody's Acting. The critics loved it, and profits from the film all but made up for his previous loss. At the age of 21, Hughes was a producer with a confirmed hit. With the limelight on him, Hughes wanted to free himself from the pressures of day-to-day business. So he hired on Noah Dietrich as an advisor.
Dietrich came to work for him in the 1930s when, as dependent as Howard was on the tool company based in Houston, he felt he needed some liaison who would be able to look over the books and advise him as to how it was doing.
Noah took the business from that point, built it up to where at times it was earning between $50 and $55 million a year in those days.
Now Hughes had time for what really interested him, the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. He established a film office and signed talented director Louis Milestone to a 3-year contract. Their first effort, Two Arabian Nights, made stars of then unknown actors Louis Wolheim and William Boyd. More importantly, it earned Hughes his first Academy Award in 1927. Next, failing to find a director who shared his love for airplanes, Hughes decided to write, produce, and direct Hell's Angels, an epic picture about 2 British flyers competing for the hand of an English socialite. Back at home, Hughes' own socialite, his wife Ella, had had enough. She filed for divorce, claiming abandonment and cruelty. For the production of Hell's Angels, Hughes employed what seemed like most of Hollywood. He acquired an air fleet that rivaled that of some small countries, buying up World War I fighter planes and hiring every available pilot in Hollywood. He even became obsessed with cloud formations, often postponing expensive production schedules until the skies were just right. On top of these headaches came a host of other problems. Hughes, an expert pilot himself, went up one day in a small scout plane he had never flown before. To the horror of the pilots and stuntmen, the plane went into a tailspin and crashed. Hughes walked away unhurt, leaving crew members to joke that at least he hadn't injured his check-writing arm. Hughes' luck was better than some. 2 other pilots died during production. By the time Hughes put finishing touches on Hell's Angels, the public had begun a love affair with the new talkie pictures. Hughes was crestfallen. He wanted Hell's Angels to be the greatest epic ever seen, but he realized that without a soundtrack, it would have little chance. Against the pleading of business directors, Hughes had a new script written and began refilming the dialogue scenes. Leading lady Greta Nielsen lost the part because of her thick Norwegian accent. Harleen Carpenter, then a bit player in Laurel and Hardy comedies, replaced her and was soon transformed by Hughes into Jean Harlow, the platinum blonde bombshell.
Would you be shocked if I put on something more comfortable?
$4 million later, the film premiered in typical Hughes style at Grauman's Chinese Theater.
You are looking at Hollywood Boulevard, illuminated for miles in honor of the opening of Hell's Angels. For the first time in history, Vine Street and Hollywood Boulevard have been made into one-way streets for 2 miles through the heart of Hollywood to facilitate the handling of the traffic, bringing the throngs to this elaborate opening.
Hell's Angels broke box office records everywhere, but privately, Hughes confided that taking a project of that size on by himself was one of his biggest mistakes. But that didn't stop him from trying to cash in on the success of Hell's Angels. He released 2 quickly produced aviation pictures, Cock of the Air and Sky Devils. Both were complete failures. Another effort, Age for Love, was equally as bad. So too was his relationship with its leading lady, Billy Dove.
Howard was very much in love with Billy Dove, who, in sound pictures, was the most beautiful woman on the screen.
But they had a falling out, and I never forgot. Howard told me that he loaded all the furniture up there from Billy's house, took it in the middle of a desolate block, strangely enough, right on Wilshire Boulevard, and set fire to the whole damn thing. Burned up the van and furniture and all. Be amazed. You wouldn't be able to do that today anywhere, I guess. But at that time, he did what he wanted.
In theaters around the country, newsreels broadcast sordid tales of thugs like Pretty Boy Floyd and John Dillinger. Hughes, reacting to moviegoers' fascination with gangsters, chose Scarface as his next project, a story loosely based on the life of Al Capone. This time, he took a more hands-off approach, allowing Howard Hawks to direct. Hawks cast Paul Muni and George Raft in the starring roles. The film, with its scenes of graphic violence, lust, rape, and hints of incest, proved to be controversial. In fact, the self-censoring Hays office blacklisted the film, insisting on a new title and a new ending. But much to the surprise of Hollywood, Hughes sued the Hayes office and won the right to show Scarface in its original form.
He had a reputation for fighting the censors. Was he a great champion of First Amendment rights? And the answer to that is no. But he saw fighting the censors as a wonderful way to drum up mercantile interest in his movies.
Hughes never lost interest in films, but for a while he stepped away from movie making and became more serious about his favorite hobby, flying. He and his Hollywood pals could regularly be seen buzzing the skies above Southern California.
Noah Dietrich used to say, you go flying around with Howard, he goes out there and he picks any airplane that's on the damn landing strip and takes off from it, and you're going to wind up getting killed. But Howard never got killed, nor did we.
Hughes would disappear for days, piloting his Boeing pursuit plane between California and Palm Springs. In 1934, Hughes entered the Boeing in an air meet in Miami. He easily won the race with an average speed of 185 miles per hour. Fueled by his success, aviation became a full-time obsession to Hughes. Working under the pseudonym Charles Howard, Hughes earned $250 a month as an assistant pilot for American Airlines. He took the job in order to learn the intricacies and mechanics of flight.
He loved to fly airplanes, loved everything about airplanes, loved the gauges in airplanes, loved to talk to pilots. The whole process, he was absorbed by it.
After only 2 months, Hughes quit American Airlines and along with mechanic Glenn Odekirk formed the Hughes Aircraft Company. Together they set out to design and build the world's fastest racer, the H-1.
That particular plane was one that he was instrumental in helping to design. But the heart of the way he designed airplanes was, he was a great brain picker. He would cull ideas from a whole range of things, weigh them, decide which ones might work, bounce them off other people. The H-1 was a perfect example of that. Outstanding, very swift, extremely modern-looking plane for its time.
On August 18, 1935, Hughes boarded the H-1 and set a land speed record of 352 miles per hour.
As ship is raised from runway and wings into the air, raps are coming off craft that has long been called the mystery plane. And then the mystery unfolds as its owner, backer, builder, and pilot, Howard Hughes, brings the plane in from its test flight for a landing at the dangerous speed of 75 miles an hour. It's only 1935, yet millionaire sportsman Howard Hughes has flown over 300 miles an hour.
Then he began to dream of bigger prizes, the transcontinental flights. The next year he flew another plane from California to Newark, set a transcontinental record for the time. The year after that, in yet another plane, he repeated the process, each time shaving off time.
Well, Howard flying from Burbank, California to New York in 7 hours and 28 minutes is certainly some speed. Now, I understand that you flew at an average speed of 332 miles an hour. Is that correct?
I'll get better than I am.
Well, is this the same ship that you set the world speed record of 352 miles an hour in?
Yes, yes.
The public was fascinated with Howard Hughes, dashing aviator. In 1937, Hughes was given the Harmon Trophy for outstanding achievement in aviation. In a White House ceremony, President Roosevelt presented Hughes with the trophy, saying he hoped someday they could fly together. By 1938, Hughes was ready to begin what would become one of his greatest achievements, a flight around the world.
If I've seemed to be in too much of a hurry to wait and pose for your pictures, it's not because I'm high-hat or anything like that, but just because I've been terribly worried that I wouldn't get out of here before the weather changed. I had a good break in the weather yesterday, and I've lost that, and I suppose it'll be fair today, but I've been in an awful rush to get away from here, and I hope you'll forgive me.
Oh, you bet. Thousands watched as Hughes and a hand-picked flight crew took to the skies aboard their modified Lockheed 14, dubbed the New York World Fair. For good luck, Hughes dipped the wings over then-girlfriend Katharine Hepburn's home and set out on a flight that would assure his name a place in aviation history.
Every conceivable kind of electronic gadget imaginable they packed onto that plane. The difference between that plane in 1938 and Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis across the water of just slightly more than 10 years before that is like night and day. I mean, the Lockheed that they flew around the world in was a very sophisticated airplane for its time that showed that interest of his in technology, and it was a great contribution towards seeing the kinds of long distances that planes could tackle.
Hughes' first landing was a record breaker in itself, from New York to Paris in 16 hours and 38 minutes.
I certainly hope that the fine friendship which now exists between America and France will continue and be an example to the other countries of the world.
With Hughes at the controls, a course was charted from Paris to Moscow and on to Siberia, as the world watched and waited for news of the brave crew. But not all the news was good. Leaving Siberia, Hughes barely averted disaster when he narrowly missed flying the Lockheed head-on into a Siberian mountain range that had been misidentified on his U.S. survey map. Arriving in New York, Hughes was celebrated as a hero, circling the globe in the astonishing time of 3 days, 19 hours, and 7 minutes.
I know you're tired. Congratulations. Welcome home. That will be tired too. Good luck. Is it true that you lost your antenna last night? What's the antenna?
For 3 days, the painfully shy Hughes endured ticker tape parades and receptions in New York, Chicago, Washington, and Houston. In 1940, Hughes decided to move his aviation experience into a more practical arena by purchasing a controlling share in Trans World Airlines. Hughes was instrumental in the growth of TWA and even conceived the original design for the Lockheed Constellation.
He called us up one day and he said, I want to take a group to New York. It's the inaugural of the new plane that we've just done. It was named after my wife, Connie Moore. It was called the Constellation. So he said, will you put the group together at your house and then meet me at the Burbank Airport? And we're going to do it as a midnight flight. So I said, sure. Who do you want? He said, get every star in the business. We had Paulette Goddard, we had Lana Turner, Merrill Oberon, Cary Grant. Every star you could think of was in that thing. I never forgot that when I called Paulette Goddard, she said, tell Howard I'll do the trip, but I want 2 round-trip tickets to Rome. And I called Howard and I said, if you want Goddard, you got to give her 2 tickets to Rome. She says, oh, that bitch, give it to her. So she had 2 tickets to Rome. At any rate, as we got off the plane in New York, and it was a blizzard, it was a blowing 60-mile-an-hour tailwind, so we flew there in a little over 5 hours, which is fantastic for a prop ship at that time.
While Howard was busy flying friends from coast to coast, the war was beginning to rage in Europe. The Defense Department called on Hughes Aircraft to supply aircraft components, artillery shells, and cannon barrels. Within the crowded Hughes aircraft hangar, work was also underway on an all-wood, long-range bomber, dubbed the D-2. By 1942, Allied ships were being decimated by German U-boats. To overcome this menace, President Roosevelt looked to Henry J. Kaiser, a businessman turned shipbuilder during the war.
And because he'd been so successful at that, the plan he proposed as much as anybody, and talked Hughes into it initially. Let's build these giant flying boats to ferry men and material across the seas. That's the way to get around the German U-boat menace. And Hughes always liked to challenge, so that sounds great.
In anticipation of the flying boat contract, Hughes began testing his amphibious Sikorsky S-43 in Nevada's Lake Mead. In the process, he was involved in a violent crash, his 4th. Hughes again escaped injury, but 2 co-pilots died in the accident. Hughes learned quickly how to move in political circles and instructed his press agent John Meyer to entertain a group of visiting military men. Among the group was President Roosevelt's son, Elliot, a man with influence in the acquisition of military aircraft. Meyer escorted the men on tours of Hollywood. He threw parties in their honor. In attendance were hopeful starlets, all too willing to lavish attention on the important visitors. These contacts, plus Hughes' powerful Washington lobbyists, resulted in securing an additional contract for 100 of Hughes' XF-11 reconnaissance aircraft, an offshoot of the earlier D-2 design. While Hughes was content with having received the contracts, the actual task of designing and manufacturing the aircraft left him mentally exhausted.
The flying boat is an astonishing achievement in some ways, but one of the most impractical things ever conceived. I mean, building a plane of that size was an enormous undertaking to begin with, but building one out of wood, where you had to measure every particular piece for its density, versus a piece of metal where you know what that density will be, absolutely nightmarish kind of thing to undertake. And it helped as much as anything to push Hughes into his first major mental breakdown, which occurred in World War II, where he went off to the desert in Nevada for several months and just basically had to isolate himself from the calls, from the pressure, from the decisions that went into building that particular. It's also one of the reasons it was not finished before the war was over.
Although World War II had ended, Hughes continued production on the flying boat and personally financed the completion of his XF-11. Many of Hughes' Hollywood friends looked on as he piloted the prototype XF-11. As in the past, Hughes insisted on personally testing his aircraft. The flight ended in tragedy as the plane lost a propeller and careened toward a residential section of Beverly Hills.
He could have saved himself. All he had to do was parachute out. But something went wrong with the plane, and he kind of fought with the plane trying to find out what was wrong with it, and then boom, all of a sudden it hit.
We were going to visit Dennis O'Keefe, who lived on the street about 2 blocks away from the country club. And as we got to Dennis's house, he said, "Christ, Howard's plane just took the top of our roof off our house and landed up in the country club, crashed." And I couldn't believe it over there, but Howard had been taken away already. He was really banged up.
Hughes was rushed to a Beverly Hills emergency room. Doctors reported that he was in shock, had serious burns, broken bones, and his torso had been crushed so badly that his heart had shifted to one side of his chest cavity. He was given morphine and left to die.
It's not entirely clear exactly how it affected him physically from then on out, but it has always been assumed that some of his attachment to codeine, which turned out to be a lifelong addiction, stemmed from that time.
Miraculously, Hughes survived, and while in the hospital showed promising signs of recovery.
While he was in the hospital and he began to feel better, they didn't have automatic beds. And Howard designed the automatic bed in the hospital where you can raise the feet or the head or the middle of it. Whatever the hell you want to do, the controls are at the bed, and all the hospitals have those beds now, and Howard designed that bed.
1 year after the crash and fully recovered, Hughes took to the air in the rebuilt XF-11. The government was not impressed and announced it would launch an investigation into Hughes' work as a defense contractor.
Mr. Hughes, the papers say that you're going back to Washington. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm going there to testify before Senator Brewster's War Investigating Committee. As you know, the committee has caused quite a stir by its investigation of my 2 airplane projects, the XF-11 photographic plane and my large flying boat.
$40 million has been paid by the government to the Hughes Aviation Company, and nothing has been thus far received. What became of the $40 million is what we want to know.
So I ask you this question again, Senator Brewster. During my last trip to Washington, and while we were having lunch in your suite at the Mayflower Hotel, did you or did you not offer to call off this entire investigation if I would agree to merge TWA, Trans World Airline, with your friend Juan Tripp's Pan American Airways?
With battle lines drawn, the hearings began on July 28, 1947, in the caucus room of the Senate Office Building. Press agent John Meyer was the first to take the stand and was questioned as to Hughes' special treatment of many government officials. including the $5,000 spent on booze, food, and women for Elliott Roosevelt and his fellow officers.
Girls were very pleasant.
What has that got to do with aircraft production?
They just went along. Every company in the business did it. We're no different.
Well, but is it, you say because she was very charming, that's the reason that you charged up $132.
That's right.
For the, which would go into the production of airplanes.
That's right.
And now, will you tell us why you gave her $20 and charged it up to the company to go home if she was very charming?
What? You taught me. Very good. Point one.
Howard Hughes was the last witness to appear and showed obvious contempt for his accusers.
Now, will you give me the questions in advance that you want to ask me while I am here? Or will you give them to any third neutral party? Is it not true that you are going to propound the questions for me as I testify and based upon what I testify as I go along? Are you willing to set aside the questions in advance which you will ask me?
Mr. Hughes.
When John Meyer failed to appear on August 8th, the committee became enraged.
Well, now, Mr. Hughes, I'm asking you what your answer was. And we're not going to have this bickering back and forth. You are before this committee, and you're going to answer the question.
You asked me just now about a reply that I made. My answer is I don't remember. Now, the man is taking it down there. Let's ask him. What?
Will you bring Mr. Mars in at the 2 o'clock session?
No, I don't think I will.
Will you try to bring him in?
No, I don't think I'll try.
All right.
Throughout the hearings, Hughes stood his ground, but the final straw came when questioning turned to the flying boat project.
I've put the sweat of my life into this thing. I have my reputation rolled up in it, and I have stated several times that if it's a failure, I'll probably leave this country and never come back, and I mean it.
Overall, the committee had made a disastrous misjudgment. They sought to prove that Hughes had profited from his wartime contracts, when in reality, he had poured millions of his own dollars into the projects. During a break in the hearings, Hughes had huge sections of the flying boat moved from Culver City to Long Beach Harbor at a cost of $50,000. Technical crews worked day and night to assemble the components, as newspapers speculated that Hughes might attempt to fly the craft before the hearings resumed. In a stroke of public relations genius, newsreel cameras rolled as Hughes led senators on an inspection of the flying boat.
I think the United States owes a great debt of gratitude to Mr. Howard Hughes for conceiving and for constructing this great plane. It's one of the most valuable contributions to aeronautical science, I believe, which has ever been made, and will be of inestimable value not only to aviation, but I believe eventually to the country's security.
On November 2nd, 1947, thousands of spectators looked on as Hughes taxied the 60-ton craft into Long Beach Harbor.
The Air Giant starts to move, driven by her 8 3,000-horsepower motors. And now for Mr. Hughes' surprise. As the enormous craft approaches her 95-mile-an-hour takeoff speed, the pilot lifts her onto the step and holds her there as she races through the choppy sea. And with the final drive of her engines, 200 tons are airborne, 5 months ahead of time. 70 feet off the water, she stays for a mile. $23 million worth of airplane has answered a lot of committee questions. It can fly.
Hughes had triumphantly proved the merit of his prized flying boat, and in the process brought about a quick end to the Brewster hearings.
When Senator Brewster realized that he was fighting a battle against public opinion, a losing battle, he folded up and took a run-out powder. Yes, that was the tip-off. When Senator Brewster hit the road for the backwoods of Maine, that meant the hearing was over. Washington was too hot for him. He couldn't take it. After that, the other senators in this committee saw no reason why they should fight Brewster's losing battle for him if he was too cowardly to remain and face the music.
I saw what Hughes did to Brewster during the hearing. And he helped choose a candidate to run against Brewster, gave financial assistance, and he defeated Brewster. And the last time I saw Owen Brewster, he was in the halls of the Senate begging for a $10,000 a year job, which he could not get.
Back in Hollywood, Hughes cultivated his image of Hollywood playboy. But as one starlet noted, Howard could have been cross-eyed and it wouldn't have mattered with all that dough.
Along with the notion that he made a lot of money, that he had a Midas touch, that he was an aviation genius, that he was a financial whiz, that he was a great movie maker. He also liked to add to that list of superlatives the fact he was a great ladies' man.
Hollywood gossip columns regularly featured Howard Hughes, linking him to scores of glamorous starlets.
He's a bachelor, very much available, and he courted every girl in the whole damn town.
At one time, I'm sure he is dated, which is a kind of a kind word for it, all the girls on the 20th Century Fox contract list. Yeah, Howard, he had them going, boy.
Howard was never a wallflower, but he didn't mingle too much either.
Yes, he was very shy around women, but he had more women than anyone. I think he had more women than Errol Flynn.
And of course, he had no trouble having dates because everyone knew who he was and everyone liked him. He used to love to go out and he'd dance. He was a good dancer. He was a good rhythm.
That guy could jitterbug, Latin dance, anything. He was fantastic. I was at the Coconut Grove one night with Howard Hughes and Marilyn Monroe. I saw him and Marilyn out there jitterbugging like crazy. Marilyn and I were drinking Dom Perignon, Howard was drinking Poland water.
What he did do with a lot of the girls, including Ginger Rogers, he'd have a whole tray of jewelry, and I mean jewelry, beautiful necklaces and brooches and rings. And unless Ginger turned him down, she wouldn't have been part of it, because she was his girl for a while. And Katherine Grayson took it. She had that whole tray of jewelry, as I remember.
In fact, he offered Elizabeth Taylor $1 million tax-free if she would marry him. But Elizabeth, who was very young at the time, I think she's still in her teens, she turned him down. Very unromantic proposal.
Unfortunately, the one trait in Howard that I never liked, and I liked this man very much, but he always told every girl he ever went with that he was going to marry her. Why the hell he said that, I don't know.
He was going with Lana Turner, and Lana was madly in love with him. And she thought sure she was going to marry him. And she went and had all the towels and bed linens monogrammed HH. When Howard found out about it, he says, "Why don't you marry Huntington Hartford?" He was very much in love with Linda Darnell, and she was gorgeous. But she told me they don't call it Hughes Tool Company for nothing.
Howard Hughes again turned a hobby into an industry when he purchased RKO Studios in May of 1948.
If he wanted to spend $22 million to buy RKO, whether RKO was a success or not didn't make much difference, because the following year, Hughes Tool would spit out another 50 or 55 million.
That was the company that year in and year out churned out the profits and made it possible for him to invest in all of these other things.
Even though he bought the studio and put some good people in there running it, he never saw the studio.
There used to be a legend that Howard Hughes went in the studio one night at midnight and said, "Paint it." Howard told me that wasn't true. He said the closest he ever got to RKO studio, he drove down Gower Street and he turned to an aide and says, "That studio needs a paint job." And the thing was painted the next day.
He used office in a little one-room office at Golden Studio. He'd have a desk and 2 wooden chairs. But he was just exactly across the aisle from a projection room. And there he would sit every night and see the rushes that were done all day long of all the various pictures at RKO. And he would sit there and pick out the scenes that he wanted put in or scenes he wanted cut.
Although Howard Hughes was now a powerful studio owner, he certainly didn't play the part.
Howard when he'd work maybe 48 to 60 hours at a time and then conk out. And he'd sometimes sleep in his car. He had the cheapest car you could buy. When I used to ride around with him, he had a Chevy, a stick shift, no radio. And I was driving with him once, and I says, Howard, with all your money, why in the hell don't you get a Rolls Royce? And he says, who do I have to impress?
And he never had a dime in his pocket, never had any money.
He'd always borrow money. He never had any money on him. He never thought about money. It just came in, you know.
I guess that Hughes Tool Company must have just given him millions to play with.
In the mid-50s, Hughes' favorite playground was Las Vegas, Nevada. He was a regular fixture at floor shows and enjoyed the company of glamorous showgirls, but only after a signed contract of silence was procured.
He moved to Las Vegas long before he bought hotels there, because he'd work 48 hours at a time, and then he'd go out and walk around the town. No one recognized him. And he liked it. You know, Las Vegas is a great place to be anonymous.
It was in Las Vegas that Howard Hughes lived in one of the few houses that he actually purchased. He called it the Greenhouse.
He lived here in the 50s, the very early 50s. And of course, it was about that time that he started to turn into this tremendous recluse. And he never returned here after he left here in 1955, I believe he left. At the time that he left it, there is a large area that had monstrous, actually hotel size, air conditioners, humidifiers, because like I say, he did have this horrible fear of germs. So the house was just literally a time capsule. Clothes were still in the closets, linens, beds were still made, just like he was planning to come back. This room that we're in right now, and is now the dining room, was actually his living room, and it was very sparsely furnished, and I would say in a I call it early motel or desperate American. It was very utilitarian, nothing pretty about it. This room was his viewing room. He watched movies constantly. He slept mostly during the day, and you'll notice on the windows the heavy, heavy screening. There were a massive amount of phones when we originally came in here, approximately 50. All of them, of course, had hearing aids, boosters on them, because he was very hard of hearing.
Within this hideaway, the only link to his business empire was this small office area, complete with a memo recorder and Edison voice writer. In Hollywood, RKO Studios took a dramatic downslide, losing over $8 million within the first few years of Hughes' control. Hughes was also responsible for firing a large number of RKO employees, whom he suspected were communists. One of the persons fired was studio head Dory Sherry.
I got a call from Howard one night, and Howard said, I've got to get rid of Dory Sherry. He's a communistic bastard, and I want him the hell out of the studio.
Hughes was such a staunch anti-communist, he appeared at the Hollywood American Legion post to make a rare speech denouncing communism. During his tenure at RKO, Hughes began the curious practice of luring hundreds of potential starlets to Hollywood with promises of fame and fortune.
That's another thing I didn't like about him. He'd see a picture of a beautiful girl who would want to Miss America or something. He'd bring her here, do a test with her at a studio, stash her in a bungalow, and she could stay there for 10 years and the bungalows were paid for.
Sometimes he'd have 20 of them on his list, you know, set them up in apartments and give them cars to drive.
But she might never ever go back to the studio again. If they did have something, he'd give them a chance, but most of the girls were not very artistically inclined. I guess they were just beautiful girls.
They'd wait by the phone for Howard to call. He might call once a month, you know.
After all the details, somebody had, for instance, Terry Moore was let go at Columbia, and Howard said, let's bring Terry Moore in. So I signed her up at the studio. It's interesting that later on, Terry came to the executives of the estate and said that she had secretly married him on the yacht.
Terry was a strict Mormon and very religious, and when she was going with Hughes, she was one of 3 Hollywood virgins in town. Terry told me, she says, I will not go to bed with Howard Hughes unless I'm married to him. She told him that to his face. So Howard, you know, had to skipper this yacht, marry him, and then he threw the log overboard. No record of it. But I'm sure it happened, because Howard would do anything to get Terry in bed.
On December 17, 1953, Hughes founded the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, although it is questioned whether this was for strictly humanitarian reasons.
He solved all of his problems by creating this tax-exempt charitable organization. And the really interesting part, of course, is that the taxpayers pick up the bill for it, because in its first or second or third years of existence, the Medical Institute, about 84% of its revenue it returns to Howard Hughes, and it spends about 1% of its revenue on actual medical research. And you go through the years, it gets something like $2 million from Hughes Aircraft Company. And in the same period of time, it pays something like $22 or $23 million to Howard Hughes as interest payments and lease payments. And so it was really the ultimate charity.
By 1955, Hughes commanded a remarkable empire. Of special note was Hughes Aircraft, a company which was doing groundbreaking research in electronics and pioneering high-tech electronic weaponry. At his office on 7000 Romaine Street, Hughes began systematically isolating himself from business contacts through a division called Operations. This strange organization was crafted by assistant Bill Gay. Gay, a devout Mormon, hired on fellow church members to serve as operators, drivers, and personal aides to Hughes.
He had one particular section of it, which was in effect like a control panel, almost like a dispatcher's desk. You think of it as at a police department. Somebody manned it 24 hours a day, receiving calls from various parts of the empire.
And these were attorneys, as well as people with the Hughes Tool Company, vice presidents, presidents, and airline people, and on and on and on. So that would consume hours just to get everybody notified of what was going on.
This was a device by remote control that enabled him to keep various parts of his empire in check and to respond to their demands when he wanted without having to directly confront a particular need.
One decision that Hughes could not insulate himself from was the purchase of a new fleet of jets for TWA. The selection and financing of the jets again drove Hughes to the brink of mental collapse. In a surprising turn of events, Hughes fired Noah Dietrich, his closest advisor of 32 years. That same year, Hughes married longtime acquaintance Jean Peters.
There are all kinds of theories at the time that he was possibly going to be committed for some mental problems, which is one of the reasons supposedly Noah Dietrich fell out of favor. By being married, he could only get the cooperation of a wife to assist in that process.
And I remember, never forget one night, she was walking out of the hotel, and I said, "Hello, Jean, how are you?" And she turned to me and she says, "Have you seen Howard lately?" Which is I thought was very strange, you know, because she was married to him at the time.
From then on, you also see a gradual mental decline in terms of those problems in his personality, fear of germs, phobias about disease and illness, an increasing desire to isolate himself from other human beings.
I found him in the garden of the Beverly Hills Hotel, wandering around, all alone, dressed. And I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I just came here to look around." I said, "Come in and have a drink with him." He said, "No, I'm going to pass Johnny," and that's the last time I saw Howard.
Under the growing pressure of the TWA decision, Hughes again sought a retreat from his problems. He flew to the Bahamas and spent his time isolated in a darkened hotel suite. He planned on making huge real estate investments, and ex-CIA man Bob Mayhew was brought in to aid in these transactions. Mayhew had been freelancing for Hughes for some time, mainly spying on ex-girlfriends and recruiting naive starlets. Before leaving the Bahamas, Hughes telephoned Mayhew and asked him to play a much more important role in the empire.
He explained to me that he did not want to make any public appearances in the future, that he wanted me to become his alter ego. He wanted me to convince the world that when they spoke to me, they in reality were speaking to Howard Hughes.
After 6 months in exile from the pressures of TWA, Hughes returned to Los Angeles and took up residence in the Beverly Hills Hotel. He began engineering a strange world within his rented bungalow. Although his room was cluttered with debris, he declared it a germ-free zone, and his staff of personal aides followed very precise methods while attending to Hughes.
For example, if you're going to open a can of food, you have to cover your hands with tissue paper. When you take the can opener to open, the bowl that the food goes into must be cleaned vigorously before that happens. When you open a car door for him to get into, he must hold the tissues over the car door.
His Romaine Street staff prepared a thick procedures manual for those working closely with Hughes.
Step number 3, washing of can. He should first soak and remove the label, and then brush the cylindrical part of the can over and over until all particles of dust, pieces of paper, and in general, all sources of contamination have been removed.
He wanted the drapes closed so people couldn't look in from outside. And at that particular time, he had me instruct the people to dip rags in alcohol and wipe all the doorknobs, so there'd be no germs on all the doorknobs.
And they had to be sanitized, so to speak. In other words, the windows had to be closed, they had to be scotch taped down and so on, et cetera, et cetera.
He wouldn't shake hands with people and didn't want people touching him.
I think we bought up all the cosmetic gloves in Beverly Hills. I don't see how they could make any more movies till they ordered some more cosmetic gloves. You're supposed to keep them on all the time. Little white gloves.
It is equally important to me that nobody ever opens any door or opening to any room, cabinet, or closet, or anything used to store any of my things, even for 1/1000th of an inch, for 1/1000th of a second. I don't want the possibility of dust or insects or anything of that nature entering.
Open the door as little as you can and get in before the bugs and everything gets in, and then close it again quickly. That's all.
Hughes rarely bathed and went naked with increasing frequency. He spent a great deal of his time cleaning anything within reach with his endless supply of Kleenex. He stopped screening films at the studio and instead had them delivered to the bungalow. His drug use had increased, and a constant stream of messengers hand-delivered bottles of codeine to the Hughes staff. When lonely, he would often call for an aide to sit silently in the bungalow.
Well, he was sitting at his table over on there, and there's 2 other chairs in the room, and he, for some reason, just said, "Chuck, that's your chair." So every time I went in there, I would sit in that same goddamn chair. And we didn't talk to him. He talked to you. He said, "Chuck, yeah, what time is it?" So we were there at different hours, back and forth. So I would get up to go over and show him my watch. And then I'd start to say, "It's 3:30, Mr. Hughes." Shh, don't say a thing. You didn't tell him what it was. You put your watch in front of him and let him decide what time it was.
Howard Hughes built his own prison, and he made sure that you couldn't escape from it. He did it himself. I mean, he just had these aides surround him, and if you needed to talk to Hughes, you didn't talk to him.
And what's sad is that most of those around him at the time were completely catering to this phobia. There wasn't one person around him who said, "Howard, this is crazy, this is silly, these things aren't going to bother you." I mean, they treated this seriously, like this was a matter of national security.
When his fear of germs subsided, Hughes was able to lapse into periods of clear thought. During one such period, he was able to negotiate financing for the fleet of TWA jets.
The way he worked out the financing was not acceptable in some ways to the TWA president and the executives of TWA.
Suit was filed against Hughes for mismanagement.
It wasn't too long after that when Hughes, for various reasons, sold all of his TWA stock at a figure which was about 86 per share, higher than it had ever, almost higher than it had ever been.
Well, the check was for $546,549,771.00.
Which I believe was probably the largest business check ever written in the United States.
That was a fair piece of change. Yeah, it's a fair piece of change.
Hughes was advised to leave California in order to escape the sizable tax that would be assessed for the newly found windfall. In an action uncharacteristic of the once famous aviator, Hughes traveled by train, first to Boston and then on to Las Vegas. Under the direction of Bob Mayhew, Hughes was taken by stretcher into a service entrance of the Desert Inn, whereupon he and his aides settled into suites on the penthouse floor. Hughes would remain there in almost constant isolation for the next 4 years. He soon overstayed his welcome as Desert Inn owners sought to regain control of their profitable high roller suites.
Came a time later where they had given an instruction to the security guards that if Hughes was not vacated in 48 hours, that they would bodily come up to the 9th floor and kick him out of the hotel.
They were very unhappy when Hughes didn't want to leave, so it ended up that we started negotiations and finally made the deal in March to acquire the hotel.
Now, in other words, he bought the hotel because he needed a place to sleep.
During negotiations for the Desert Inn, Hughes' tax attorneys informed him that casino receipts qualified as active income. This effectively solved his tax dilemma.
He was in ecstasy. He called me and he said, imagine, this is money from heaven. Are there any more of these joints available?
And so after that, we started to buy more hotels. He got excited about it and had all this cash laying around, so to speak.
About that time, he made up his mind that he wanted to be the biggest in the gaming business.
Hughes embarked on a spending spree that resulted in the ownership of the Desert Inn, Sands, Castaways, Frontier, Silver Slipper, and Landmark casinos.
Las Vegas at that time had that image of being the center of organized crime, that organized crime was very deeply involved in it.
And Mr. Hughes came in and purchased those casinos that the state felt they were having trouble with, and he was very welcome in that regard.
He shifted the emphasis, the public emphasis from Las Vegas, the organized crime people, to Las Vegas, the billionaire industrialist.
The state of Nevada made exceptions for its most famous citizen.
Historically, everyone who asks for a Nevada gambling license has to personally appear before the Gaming Control Board or Gaming Commission.
And in each case, he refused to make an appearance. He refused to furnish fingerprints, contemporary photos, or financials.
That was one of my responsibilities as well, incidentally, to convince the state gaming licensing authorities not to require his personal appearance. So they adopted what they call the Hughes rule.
Hughes was not content with being the biggest in the gaming industry. He also sought to influence government citywide and statewide.
Mr. Hughes wanted to have a summary of every bill introduced in the Nevada legislature, and he wanted me to pass on his comments to the legislator, which I did. He had an insatiable appetite to want his views to be known and be accepted as far as certain legislation was concerned. He's a very bright human being. Most of the things he requested me to do, and Mr. Mayhew to do, not all of them, but most of them, were good recommendations. Some of them we couldn't carry out.
One of the more difficult requests to come out of the penthouse was to try to halt construction of the International Hotel. Hughes felt that owner Kirk Kerkorian was stealing his limelight.
It was almost funny. I mean, when he gave me the assignment to try to dissuade Kerkorian from building the big International, I could not succeed because Kirk had made up his mind that that's what he was going to do.
And we said, okay, we'll go ahead, but we really couldn't do it, and we really didn't try, because it was an embarrassing situation to try and stop another hotel from being built.
He had me talk to Kirk on a series, on many, many instances, trying to discourage him because of the underground testing, that although high-rise hotels would collapse, and Kirk just went about his business. And although he was always very friendly to Mr. Hughes, but he didn't pay a damn bit of attention to what we had to say.
Howard Hughes' irrational thought process affected the profitability of his own hotels.
The Tournament of Champions was at the Desert Inn. It was a regular annual golf tournament that brought in the best pros and a lot of stars and a lot of tourists, and Hughes canceled the Tournament of Champions.
And to think that you would take this kind of an asset and just say, we'll turn it over gratis to someone else if they'll take us off the hook, was incomprehensible to me. Yes, it bothered me. And of course, the fact that his reason was that it would create too many germs bothered me even more.
Hughes seemed to desire control of the whole state of Nevada as he sat in the darkened penthouse charting a map of his newest acquisitions, which included huge tracts of undeveloped land, the North Las Vegas airport, numerous mining claims, and a television station which was bought not only for investment purposes.
He wanted to watch the movies that he wanted to watch on television. He's watching a lot of television. And so I think maybe that was the motivation for buying that station.
Howard Hughes would watch the movies all night long, and as a general rule, he would have an aide call the next day complaining about the movie that ran last night. And this was almost an everyday occurrence. It would happen a lot.
He was the one that decided what movies were going to be shown, what was available, and get this movie from California. And so it ended up that whatever movie was scheduled, if he didn't want to run that, he'd say, I want to see this.
As Hughes kept occupied by watching films broadcast by his newly acquired TV station, Bob Mayhew took on an increasingly powerful and influential role in the Hughes empire. Although he had never met Hughes, he now held the title of head of Hughes Nevada operations.
And consequently, we began using the Romaine Street office in Hollywood less and less.
He very strongly told me, upon his arrival in Las Vegas, that not only did he want a complete severance from the group at 7000 Romaine, which was Bill Gay and his associates, but he didn't want any of them to even come to Las Vegas.
And there was a power play going on between Bill Gay, Chester Davis, and Bob Mayhew. They were getting shunted farther aside, and Mayhew was coming up in the ranks.
Bill Gay, Frank William Gay, the real name, but everybody called him Bill. Bill formulated his power, if that's the correct word, power. He formulated his authority in that he controlled the aides who surrounded Howard Hughes.
The aides really became his family, and they supplied his food. They gave him the drugs he took every day, whether it was the Valium or the codeine or whatever. They were his whole life support system.
Nobody had direct access to Hughes. The aides had direct access to Hughes, and Bill Gay had direct access to the aides. So if you wanted to talk to Hughes, you had to talk to Bill, and Bill in turn had to talk to the aides.
Hughes paid no attention to the double dealing taking place within his empire and continued to focus his attention on television. It was while watching TV that Hughes learned of a new round of atomic testing planned for Nevada. He became paralyzed with fear. He knew that unlike the germs that he fought to shield himself from, radiation could not be prevented from entering his carefully guarded environment. He declared war on the Atomic Energy Commission and pledged unlimited resources in stopping the tests.
That's one of the reasons he established that power in Nevada. He was, trying to pull a lot of political strings to get that atomic testing stopped.
I recall a particular test called, it was codenamed Boxcar. And it was a large underground nuclear test. I think they were figuring it was about equal to about 1 million tons of TNT, megaton. And Hughes absolutely wanted that thing stopped.
He bent every effort humanly possible to stop the tests in Nevada at the test site, but we were unsuccessful in that regard. And we had to stop pushing too hard because it was becoming embarrassing.
I remember numerous briefings with the Department of Energy prior to the Boxcar detonation. And I know that the reason that occurred was on the other side of the street. The Hughes people are saying, you can't do this, you've got to stop this.
These were genuine concerns, and he wrote memo after memo on these subjects in trying to get the test stopped.
I say Nevada is no longer so desperate for mere existence that it has to accept and swallow with a smile poisonous, contaminated radioactive waste material more horrible than human excrement.
Unable to prevent the boxcar test, Hughes stepped up the battle and decided to garner support from whichever candidate would replace outgoing President Lyndon Johnson.
To put all this in true perspective, what happened is that Hughes made a decision on the same day, wrote me a memo telling me that he wanted me to see Richard Nixon as soon as possible and offer him unlimited help with his campaign, because it was very important that he, Richard Nixon, be the next president of the United States. The same day, he sent me another memo saying to go see Hubert Humphrey and offer him unlimited support because it was very important that he be the next president of the United States.
In order to cover all bases, Hughes attempted a last-ditch effort to appeal to President Johnson.
Well, on 2 occasions, he wanted me to offer $1 million to then presidents to try to stop the underground testing. And by that time, I had reached a point in my world with him where I knew that I had to give him the impression that I was doing it for fear that he'd give the assignment to someone who'd be stupid enough to try.
By 1970, Hughes' health was clearly failing. As evident by logs maintained by the aides, he was taking an increasing amount of narcotics, including Emprin, an injectable form of codeine. He was also ingesting massive amounts of Valium, referred to as blue bombers by Hughes. As a result of the drug use, he was often constipated and required frequent enemas. He insisted that his urine be preserved in jars and stored in the closet of the penthouse. He was sleeping more and eating less. His kidneys were shrinking as a result of his 20-year addiction to codeine. Hughes was too far gone for wife Jean Peters, who had not seen her husband in over 3.5 years. She filed for divorce. Another battle had begun between Bob Mayhew and Hughes' personal aides, who were tightening their grip on Hughes.
I began to get the impression that some of my memos were not getting through to him.
It's probably where Mayhew may have misjudged, is that they still controlled the flow of information. And that was the ultimate test. They determined, what information got to Hughes and whether Mayhew's information got to Hughes. And that was very critical, absolutely.
Communication shut down. Nobody could communicate. I had some very important things I had to communicate through Mayhew, through Bob Mayhew, and Mayhew had no communication with him. They just shut us down. And you obviously sensed something wrong in that situation.
I think Mayhew was an empire builder, and I think he enjoyed the power and the position that he had in representing Hughes's interests. But I think he allocated to himself certain powers and privileges that were a little excessive.
I think jealousy, envy, and the fact that it looked like Mayhew was building his own empire within the Hughes empire that caused the demise of Bob Mayhew.
There's no doubt in my mind that they convinced him that I, in fact, had stolen money from him. And it breaks my heart to think that Howard Hughes died without knowing the difference.
On November 13, 1970, a proxy came over the telecopier in the Desert Inn penthouse. It finalized an action that had been in the planning stages for months. Upon receiving Hughes' signature, the proxy effectively placed executive Bill Gay and Chester Davis, a Hughes TWA attorney, in control of the Hughes Nevada holdings. On November 25, 1970, the Desert Inn penthouse was empty.
They took this man out of here Thanksgiving Eve. It was a very cold night when his doctor had told me 2 days earlier that he was so sick that he would not move him from the Desert Inn to Sunrise Hospital, which is not a mile away, unless it were a dire emergency.
Well, he clearly was not in good physical shape when he left the Desert Inn. I mean, you're looking now at someone who, who is consuming large quantities of Valium, codeine, other drugs.
Curiously, it was later revealed that despite his critical illness, the amounts of codeine and Valium made available to and apparently used by Hughes during the weeks shortly before the proxy was obtained soared to among the highest levels of his life.
They took this man on this night, waltzed him down 9 flights of exterior fire escape, and brought him to Nellis Airport and flew him to the Bahamas.
The contact that law enforcement and that media and that the public had as far as Hughes was Bob Mayhew. And Bob Mayhew sincerely believed that Hughes was forced to leave here against his will.
But there was some confusion as to who was the leader, who was in power, who should the political people listen to.
I began getting calls from the casino managers saying that people were moving into the cages. I called the governor. I said, has this been cleared with you? No. I called the Gaming Control Board. Has this been cleared with you? No. Called the Gaming Commission? No.
Mayhew was saying, I'm in charge. Holliday, Davis, and Gay were saying, no, we're in charge. And it was like a war. It was going on. One camp was headquartered at the Sands. Another camp was headquartered at the Frontier.
That confusion lasted for several months until it finally, the papers were sent in, powers of attorney were sent in to the government officials, placing Chester Davis and others in charge. So that was sufficient for them to feel comfortable that Mayhew was out and the new people were in.
I was sick. But then I realized that the battle was over. I mean, I realized that somehow, whatever they had done, they had convinced him that I was on the wrong side of the fence.
In the beginning of December, Hughes settled into a penthouse at the Britannia Beach Hotel on Paradise Island, far removed from the troubles prompted by his leaving Las Vegas. Little did Hughes know that a man whom he had never met would cause a far greater problem. That man was Clifford Irving. Irving was an author with 8 books to his credit, the most popular being Fake, a story about art forgeries. In 1971, Irving himself was crafting a far more substantial hoax. Irving announced that he was collaborating with Hughes on an autobiography and produced forged letters purportedly written by Hughes, proving that he was a willing participant. The McGraw-Hill Publishing Company felt satisfied with the documents and advanced Irving $100,000 for publishing rights. Although the Hughes Tool Company denied the authenticity of the book, there was no way to bring Hughes out of isolation to prove it. Irving seemingly crafted the perfect scam, for no one had so much as seen Hughes for over a decade, and many questioned his very existence.
Then it got to be of concern to, I don't know whether it was probably government officials as well as the public. Does Howard Hughes exist? Is he alive?
There was a very serious thought in the public and among many people who were in areas of authority that thought he was probably dead. And these people were merely speaking for him.
In an attempt to placate nervous Nevada gaming officials, Hughes placed a call to former Governor Paul Laxalt. Hughes' mental condition at the time seems questionable, given this memo that was passed to him before the call was placed.
Your conversation should be exactly as the script was outlined to you. Make it most emphatic, with no discussion as to why, just a confirmation. However, it would be a good idea to mention your loss of confidence in Mayhew, and you could end by emphasizing your intention to return to Las Vegas after your business trip.
One of them said to me, they said, wait a minute, you know, he talked on the phone to your predecessor, and, you know, he was satisfied. Well, I said, I'm not my predecessor. I like my predecessor, Paul Laxalt, but I can't tell on the phone whether this is Howard Hughes or not.
In order to end the confusion caused by the Irving hoax, it was decided that Hughes would speak via telephone to a group of reporters who had known him before he became reclusive.
Hughes called me up from the Britannia Beach Hotel in the Bahamas the day before, and he says, I'm going to come out and expose Clifford Irving as a big hoax. And he said, I'm going to have a press conference, which I'll talk on the phone. He said, I want you on it. We assembled in this room, and all the other reporters, you know, asked all kinds of trick questions, make sure it was Howard Hughes and not Rich Little. And of course, when it came my turn, I said, I know that voice anywhere. He said, you know, I've heard it too many times. It's etched in my memory.
When asked about Clifford Irving, Hughes simply responded, I don't know him. Reporters, however, took the liberty of asking far more personal questions.
Someone asked him about a reporter he had fingernails 10 inches long. And, you know, he laughed about it. He says, how in the hell could I write my name?
And all the correspondents chuckle at it as well, like these stories are exaggerated. But the stories weren't exaggerated. He was just that loony at the time. But what is intriguing about him is that he knew the outside world would frown on him if they knew he was that way.
And I, at that time, made a remark that as far as I was concerned, there's nothing but a big circus. They said, oh yeah, that's his voice. Well, you know, what's the big deal?
Why don't we just see this voice? If everything is fine? And so we had some doubts on whether or not he was really in control of his company.
For the next 7 months, Hughes and his aides circled the globe in exile of corporate lawsuits and the ever-present horde of photographers attempting to snap a picture of the elusive billionaire. In each location, Hughes returned to his familiar world of a darkened hotel suite. He was constantly drugged and spent most of his waking hours viewing films projected on a screen at the foot of his bed. Hughes was oblivious to the ongoing TWA lawsuit and was in no condition to fight as executives pressured him to sell his namesake, the Hughes Tool Division.
TWA ultimately sued Hughes and was awarded a substantial judgment. And Hughes Tool Company, which had provided all the money through the years to fund all of Howard's various enterprises, from the filmmaking to the airplanes to everything, Howard gets enormous pressure to sell it. And this is at a time when he's really totally isolated under the control of basically the people who are around him every day.
But I'm sure he had long-standing feelings of closeness, and he probably had some regret in having to let it go.
He lost roughly $1/3 of $1 billion as a result of that sale. It was probably one of the worst business decisions ever made. In the 5 years after he sold the company, he had made more than he received for it, which was something like $150 million. And this is one of the times you see the really tragic side of Hughes's life, because he's convinced he has to sell it. He sells it. The judgment, of course, is later overturned. He really didn't have to.
One person who gained from the sale was Bill Gay, who now became executive vice president.
The title of president was reserved to Howard Hughes. Everything Bill said was supposedly based on word from on high. It wasn't until after Hughes's death that we began to wonder if anybody ever did, if Hughes ever did make those pronouncements.
The new executive committee decided to consolidate the remaining Hughes Nevada holdings into an umbrella corporation.
The new company that is created for the remainder of his holdings is called Summa Corporation. And when he first sees the name, he doesn't even understand what it is.
If you stop and consider, all of the companies that Hughes owned prior to Summa were all Hughes. There was Hughes Aircraft, Hughes Helicopters, Hughes this, Hughes Oil Company, Hughes Tool Company, Hughes, whatever it was, had Hughes in the name. Summa suddenly became the first company that didn't have a Hughes name on it, Summa.
It's one of those really sad points when you realize here is his, the business that provided the basis for everything that he did is gone. In the surviving business, he doesn't even know what the name means.
In March of 1973, Hughes moved again, this time to the Inn on the Park Hotel in London. He briefly broke out of his self-imposed isolation and agreed to a face-to-face meeting with Governor O'Callaghan.
We went up late at night, it's after midnight, to meet with him. And they brought him in, he walked in, and we shook hands, and we sat down, and I asked the questions that had to be asked to make sure that, that we had the right person. Here's a man who was alive, it was his money, and he wanted to do this with his money, and that's fine.
He had to find someplace where a now deteriorating individual whose health was deteriorating could in fact live easily. His last port of call, of course, was Mexico.
Hughes was told that he had been moved to Acapulco because drugs were no longer available in Freeport. In actuality, the drugs were supplied by a New York pharmaceutical house.
He is no longer probably mentally in control, of his complete faculties. It would certainly appear that way when you're looking at the memos he's writing, when you're looking at all the drugs he's consuming.
I'm not so sure the new people that came on board thought about protecting him at all. They may have thought only about themselves and how they could enhance their own lives.
You also saw this by virtue of the fact that the people were, back in those days, trying to get him to, well, where's your will? Get the will all in shape. There was a lot of concern.
Hughes never gave anything of the company away. He never gave anything of the company away. So everybody was trying to get a secure position.
Those aides, some of those aides at that time were making $75,000 a year for delivering messages, taking telephone calls. That may not seem like a lot of money today, but if you go back in time, in that year, median family income, meaning the average family in the U.S. was earning $12,000. So if you were looking at that today, he would be paying these people to do these errand jobs almost $250,000.
I can go down that whole list. If I were in the headhunting business, I don't know where I'd start to find any one of them a $10,000 job.
The last days of Howard Hughes lie in sharp contrast to a man who once controlled his life with such vigor. Hughes lay so weakened, he could no longer muster the strength to inject himself with codeine.
There was a story on the wire about a doctor in Mexico that had examined Hughes, and he was the first indication that I read, this is prior to many books that were published, that Hughes was definitely in very poor physical condition when the heat got to him.
He's got bed sores all over him. He's got a gaping sore on his head, bruises, and although the doctor doesn't see this, he's got broken hypodermic needles in his arm.
And it wasn't the kind of physical condition that had just developed during a week or so of illness. It was the kind of physical condition that apparently developed over many years of either a lifestyle or neglect.
The doctor's just looking at him physically and saying, why isn't this man in a hospital? And that's really a sad picture of a person who has deteriorated to that point, and no one really seems to care.
And it's not the Howard Hughes that I knew. He was helpless, really helpless.
Probably the most striking thing is this picture of a man who basically is all alone.
While there are the aides around him and people who have been around him for a long period of time, there isn't what you would call anybody really close to him.
I hate to think so, but I think he probably was very sad at the end. He had no more TWA, no more Spruce Goose, no more studio. He just had a lot of money.
On April 5th, 1976, Hughes slipped into a coma. His body lay still, except for tremors in the muscles of his face. Hughes' personal physician was called to the penthouse, but instead of immediately attending to the comatose Hughes, he spent nearly 2 hours rummaging through the files kept in the suite.
He began shredding documents that were in the hotel. And I have a feeling that there was a lot of this going on throughout the Hughes organization in those last days. And a lot of documents were being destroyed. And the question always is, what were they and why?
4 hours after the doctor arrived, Hughes was loaded into an air ambulance chartered for Houston, where arrangements had been made for a hospital admission.
He had a beard, long, scraggly type hair, gray hair, and just a very shriveled up type of appearance, like he'd lost a lot of weight.
He looked almost dead when he boarded the airplane, you know, his eyes were wide open and there was really very little life at all, if any, left in him. He was alive, though, because I did notice his mouth moved just a little bit once or twice.
As we were taxiing into the customs ramp, the doctor in the back said, just take your time, there's no need to hurry any longer. That's how we knew at that time. He died apparently as we were descending into Houston, just as we were coming in, approaching the airport.
The preliminary autopsy findings demonstrated that Mr. Hughes died of chronic renal disease.
One of the interesting things on that original autopsy was that the report said that he had a very minimal amount of codeine in his body, and it was an amount basically commensurate with anyone taking a therapeutic dose of codeine, something a dose that's recommended. But what you see is that the volume he had in his body, that people in the past had died from such volumes. We did the story that he had a potentially lethal dose of codeine in his body, and up until that point that hadn't been reported.
Also concealed in the original autopsy reports were these x-rays, showing the remains of hypodermic needles that had been broken off in both arms.
I think you look at the man's physical condition when he arrives in Houston aboard the plane, and I think anybody has to ask the question, how does someone get in this condition?
Can you imagine a man with 7 broken hypodermic needles in his arm? A man who's responsible for having built the biggest medical foundation in the history of man? Having a sore that oozes a bone that's sticking out of his shoulder.
This is not the picture of someone who is being really cared for. And the question is why?
I've often said that people have asked me, do you think they killed this man? And my answer is a very, I believe, fair one. If sheer negligence qualifies as a weapon, yes, they did.